Order, please. We'll begin the daily routine presenting read petitions. The honourable member for Pictou West.
Speaker, I beg leave to table a petition on behalf of the residents of the White Hill, Pictou County, concerning their road. And while we realize there's a tender to be called there very shortly, still the residents have asked me to table the petition. And the operative clause reads, we, the rural community of White Hill, Pictou County, are insistent that the paved road, which we have been petitioning, lobbying, media interviews, and endless calls locally abroad to the Department of Transportation, be repaved immediately as it presents itself as a safety hazard for several years. It is unsafe for school bus transportation, motorists, and pedestrians. And Mr. Speaker, there's 169 residents have signed this petition, and I too have affixed my signature.
This is table. Presenting reports of committees. Table reports, regulations, and other papers. Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to table the annual report of the Public Trustee for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2005.
Report is tabled. Statements by ministers. Government notice of motion. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I would like to make an introduction in advance of my resolution. To all members of the House, and there, thank you. I thought I saw her come in. I want to introduce a very special addition to the province of Nova Scotia, Jennifer Evans. She is the new provincial librarian, and she comes to the province from Alderney Public Library in Dartmouth, where she has, in the course of her career, provided exceptional leadership and public library experience here in the province. And I'd like all members to join me in welcoming her to the House. And Mr. Speaker, I should add that she is accompanied by Bruce Mosier, who is her husband. There he is. Lee Mosier, her daughter, and also Angie Mosier, her daughter. So we welcome them as well. And I would also add just a little bit, we found somebody else whose handwriting equals my own.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Test of literacy.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas this year, for the first time, Canadians are celebrating a common Canadian Library Week from coast to coast. And whereas libraries are a repository of knowledge, heritage, and culture, and an enabler of learning, creativity, and imagination. And whereas in the coming year, Nova Scotians will see technology upgrades and other improvements in their public libraries. Therefore, be it resolved that all Nova Scotians should visit their local public library during Canadian Library Week, October 17 to 24, 2005. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Mr. Waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas yesterday, October 16th, the Halifax Regional Police held their 23rd annual Law Enforcement Memorial Service to honor Canadian officers who lost their lives over the past years. And whereas the work of law enforcement officers can at times place their lives in grave danger, and whereas all members recognize the tremendously important work done by our law enforcement officers, therefore it be resolved that this House honor those officers from across Canada who have given their lives so that we may live in a more peaceful and secure society. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Human Resources.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Girl Guides of Canada challenge and inspire girls and women to discover, experience, and develop the best within themselves. And whereas the Girl Guide movement empowers women and girls to lead and serve as responsible citizens. And whereas the Girl Guides of Canada are celebrating 95 years of dedicated service. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the House recognize the contribution of the Girl Guide movement and the many Nova Scotia women and girls whose involvement with Girl Guides have helped make this province a better place to live. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Internet is at the same time an incredible educational and entertainment resource and an environment where children must learn to exhibit reasonable caution. And whereas AOL Canada and Toshiba of Canada sponsored a National Online Safety Week contest designed to help children learn about how to use the Internet responsibly. And whereas New Germany Elementary School is the official winner of the Online Safety Week contest, earning a computer lab comprised of 6 Toshiba laptops and cases for the school. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate both the administration, staff, and students of New Germany Elementary School, as well as the staff and management of AOL Canada and Toshiba of Canada for their combined efforts to make the Internet a safer place for our children. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the week of October the 16th to the 22nd is Foster Family Appreciation Week, and there are approximately 700 loving, dedicated, and caring foster families in Nova Scotia. And whereas foster families across the province are being celebrated this week with thank you cards featuring artwork and poetry created by children and youth in care. And whereas foster families participate in a comprehensive training program to prepare them to provide loving and nurturing homes for children and youth during very difficult times, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House extend their gratitude to Nova Scotia's foster families for opening their hearts and homes to children in need. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. Introduction of bills. The Honourable Minister of Tourism, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And before I introduce the bill being put forward, my little cold problem. Mr. Speaker, I wish to introduce a couple of members, individuals with us in the East Gallery. Before I introduce these bills on behalf of the Honourable Minister of Health, we have with us, Mr. Speaker, the presence of Dr. Jeff Sangster, President of the Nova Scotia Association of Optometrists, and also Mr. John Butler, Board Chair of the Nova Scotia Board of Dispensing Opticians, who have done a great deal of work in preparation of the bills being put forward. And I would ask them to rise and receive the warm welcome of the House, Mr. Speaker.
We welcome our special guest to the gallery. Hope they enjoy the proceedings. Honourable Minister on the bill.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill, an act respecting the practice of optometry.
The Honourable Minister begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act Respecting the Practice of Optometry.
Bill 232, entitled An Act Respecting the Practice of Optometry.
Or this bill be read a second time at a future date. Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby do beg leave to table a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 2 of the Acts of 1991, the Energy Efficient Appliances Act.
Honourable Member for Dartmouth East begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 2 of the Acts of 1991, the Energy Efficient Appliance Act.
Bill 233, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 2 of the Acts of 1991, the Energy Efficient Appliances Act.
Or this bill be read a second time at a future date. Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989 of the Motor Vehicle Act.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989 of the Motor Vehicle Act.
Bill 234, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act.
Will this bill be read a second time at a future date? The honourable Minister of Tourism, Culture and Heritage.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Honourable Minister of Health, I beg leave to introduce Bill, an act respecting dispensing opticians.
The Minister begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act Respecting Dispensing Opticians.
Bill 235, entitled An Act Respecting Dispensing Opticians.
Or this bill be read a second time at a future date. Notice the motion. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day, I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Atlantic Mayors Congress took place this past weekend, October 15th and 16th, in Summerside, Prince Edward Island, and whereas the record high cost of home heating, particularly for pensioners and others on a fixed income, was a major concern expressed by the mayors from across the region, and whereas the mayors called upon the federal government to remove the GST and therefore the HST from home heating, therefore be it resolved that the House joins with the Atlantic Mayors Congress in urging the immediate removal of sales tax from home heating, which is a necessity of life in Atlantic Canada. Mr. Speaker, I would request waiver and passage without debate.
Request waivers are agreed. Here are no. Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Cape Breton South.
Good idea.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas October 16 to October 22nd, 2005 is Foster Family Appreciation Week. Whereas there are more than 700 foster families in Nova Scotia, and this week provides an opportunity to recognize foster families across the province for their dedication to young people. And whereas the theme of this year's Foster Family Appreciation Week is Open Doors, Open Hearts. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the legislature acknowledge the importance of foster families in Nova Scotia and recognize the important role they play in serving the needs of young people in their care. I would ask for waiver, Mr. Speaker.
Waivers are agreed. All those in favour say aye. Counter-minded nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Nova Scotia's country singing sensation, formerly hailing from Pictou County, has recently made headlines once again. And whereas in September, the Canadian Country Music Awards celebrated George Canyon's talents with 4 awards, whereas he was singled out for Male Artist of the Year, the Fans' Choice Award, as well as Single of the Year and Songwriter for his emotional hit entitled My Name, co-written with Cape Breton's own Gordie Sampson. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this legislature applaud once again this modest Nova Scotian rising star who, regardless of the attention he has received to date, felt prior to the awards that his name wouldn't be on any of them, let alone 4. I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Waivers are agreed. All those in favour say aye. Counter-minded nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Duke of Edinburgh Awards annually recognizes youths from across Canada who participate in community service, skills development, physical fitness, and other extracurricular activities. And whereas 21-year-old Mount Ellison University student Matt Connor from Cole Harbour demonstrates his commitment to community service as a member of the Nova Scotia rowing team and as a lifeguard, participated in the 2001 Canada Games and attended a week-long Leaders' Day camp in Toronto. And whereas on June 2nd, 2005, at a ceremony in Charlottetown, 21-year-old Matt Connor was awarded the Duke of Edinburgh Gold Award from His Royal Highness the Earl of Wessex, Prince Edward. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the House of Assembly congratulate Matt Connor for receiving the Duke of Edinburgh Gold Award and wish him continued success in his future endeavors. And Mr. Speaker, I would request waiver and passage without debate.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Kings West.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Minister of Natural Resources released his government's plan to deal with the off-highway vehicles in Nova Scotia on October 12th, and whereas the Minister at the time his plan was released couldn't spare much time for Nova Scotians as he was just too busy, and whereas the Minister didn't really seem to understand his government's plan anyways, therefore be it resolved that the members of the House remind the Minister that as long as he and his party intend to go back to the voters for support come election time, he had best make time for Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for no. I hear no. Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas after 20 years of loyal and dedicated service to the municipality of Pictou, Clyde Purvis has retired as the municipality's Chief Administration Officer. And whereas a reception in Clyde's honor was held recently in late September to recognize Clyde's contribution to the local government in Pictou County since 1985. And whereas besides the reception, a roast was also held for Clyde to recognize his retirement milestone and his 20 years with the municipality of Pictou. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House applaud the hard work and dedication shown by Clyde Purvis to his job over the past 20 years, in which he and his wife Sharon nothing but good times, good health, and happiness. And Mr. Speaker, I seek waiver of notice.
Waivers are agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Lobsters in the City, a fundraiser for the Abilities Foundation of Nova Scotia, has been a huge success throughout the Halifax Regional Municipality. Whereas the 2004-2005 grade 6 class of Dana Grant at Astle Drive Elementary School drew their inspiration from the fundraiser to produce their own versions of the lobsters, adorned in various colors and designs. Whereas the students at Astle Drive Elementary School paid 25 cents to vote for their favorite design, and all proceeds went to the Abilities Foundation of Nova Scotia. Therefore, be it resolved that this House congratulates the students of Dana Grant's grade 6 class at Astle Drive Elementary School for their efforts in raising money for the Abilities Foundation of Nova Scotia through their creative lobster designs. And I ask for waiver, Mr. Speaker.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on October the 16th, 2005, the Children's Wish Foundation McCain Wishmakers Parade was held in Halifax and Dartmouth, and whereas the volunteers organized a parade which brought in $23,000 for Children's Wish Foundation, and whereas the Children's Wish Foundation helps children cope with a serious illness by giving them hope, comfort, and allows children to be children. Therefore, it be resolved that the members of this House of Assembly congratulate the organizers of the Wishmakers Parade and all those who supported this worthy cause. And I'd ask for waiver.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas after a year and a half of hard work, a new RCMP Community Policing Office opened in Mill Cove this summer. And whereas Constable Adri Zahara hosted the opening of the new office, attended by a large group of officers and citizens, saying this will be a great resource for the community. And whereas the new Mill Cove site will be manned 4 to 6 hours each week and is the third such office to be opened in the area served by the Chester office in the past 4 years. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House thank all of the hardworking officers and members of the community that support these community policing offices, and also for recognizing a need and stepping in to lend their strong presence to the area. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas World Food Day is celebrated each year on October 16th and is recognized in 150 countries as a day for raising public awareness concerning global food issues. And whereas on this past Sunday, October 16th, The 9th annual Oxfam Hunger Banquet was held in Halifax to commemorate World Food Day. And whereas this annual event provides a forum to raise awareness of issues of global food security and hunger, and an opportunity for individuals to begin to take action. Therefore, be it resolved that the Nova Scotia Legislature be mindful of issues of global food security and hunger, as well as urgent local issues of poverty and hunger, as demonstrated by the continuing need for food banks. And Mr. Speaker, I seek waiver and passage without debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Clare.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Attendu que le réseau néo-écossais de l'initiative canadienne sur le bénévolat a tenu son premier congrès en septembre, attendu que les bénévoles et des organisations sont venus de partout en travers de la province pour partager des idées et planifier des activités pour l'avenir, et attendu que le réseau Nouvelle-Écosse est engagé dans un dialogue pour soutenir les efforts de tous les bénévoles de la Nouvelle-Écosse, qu'il soit résolu que les membres de cette Assemblée félicitent et remercient les organisateurs et les participants au congrès provincial du réseau Nouvelle-Écosse de l'initiative canadienne du bénévolat. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Nova Scotia network of the Canada Volunteerism Initiative held their first annual provincial conference in September, and whereas volunteers and organizations from across the province took part in 3 days of idea sharing and planning for the future, and whereas the Nova Scotia Network is committed to an open exchange of ideas in the best interests of all Nova Scotian volunteers, therefore it be resolved that all members of this House congratulate the Nova Scotia Network of the Canada Volunteerism Initiative for an excellent conference and thank them for their work thus far. And Mr. Speaker, I would ask for waiver of notice, please.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas renovations at the Lillian Fraser Memorial Hospital in Tatamagouche got a jump start from 2 nonprofit groups this past July, and whereas the North Shore Health Services Foundation and the Lillian Fraser Memorial Hospital Auxiliary made a combined donation of $100,000 towards the required $500,000 needed to complete the renovations, and whereas the renovation project will allow for expansion of satellite services and clinics, and renovations will also be made to the hospital's emergency room, inpatient area, and laboratory services. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House thank the North Shore Health Services Foundation and the Lillian Fraser Memorial Hospital Auxiliary for recognizing a need and boldly stepping in to help fundraise for these important renovations. Mr. Speaker, I ask for request waiver.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. Honourable member for Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas volunteers work every day to help find a cure for cancer, and whereas Mrs. Ellen Laffin, along with helping out where needed for the past 20 years with the Ladies Auxiliary of the Knoll and District Volunteer Fire Department, has provided valuable assistance to the Canadian Cancer Society during their fundraising drives. Whereas on May 27th, on Volunteer Awards Night, Mrs. Laffin was recognized by the municipality of East Hants with the Shining Star Award for doing her part in beating cancer. Therefore, be it resolved that the House of Assembly congratulate Ellen Laffin on her award and thank her for taking up the fight against cancer. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and pass without debate.
For waivers, it agreed. All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the 3rd week of October is designated as Canadian Citizenship Week, providing an opportunity for us to celebrate the privilege and responsibility our Canadian citizenship awards us. And whereas throughout the world many individuals and families are looking to improve their quality of life and choose to come to Canada and add to our culture and diversity. And whereas this is a time for us to recognize the value of our Canadian citizenship citizenship and encourage immigration, which continues to strengthen our nation. Therefore, be it resolved that members of this House reflect upon the importance of Canadian Citizenship Week and recognize how fortunate we are to be Canadian. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Guysborough, Sheet Harbour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Holland Harbour in Guysborough County can now boast to have the tallest sculpture in Nova Scotia, and whereas German sculptor Helga Natz spent several months of the year in Seal Harbour, where she has a studio, and created the sculpture as an example of contemporary artwork becoming part of the natural landscape. And whereas the steel and sand sculpture has garnered a lot of local support from businesses, Matheson and Company in New Glasgow produced the sculpture, C.J. McClellan and Associates Incorporated in Antigonish arranged the structural engineering of the concrete base, and George F. McDonald and Sons Limited in Rocky Mountain excavated and prepared the location. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House thank Helga Natz for her amazing sculpture, and also all of the businesses involved in bringing this to light. Passage without debate.
Waiver is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas this summer the first annual Great East Dartmouth Barbecue was held, and even though there was a bit of rain, it did not dampen the spirits of those who attended. And whereas those who did come out enjoyed hot dogs, a bounce castle, and had a chance to meet some new neighbors, and whereas a date has been set for next year's event for August the 12th, which is shaping up to be bigger and better, therefore be it resolved that this House thank all those who made the day possible, including the United Way, Dartmouth Community Health Board, Dartmouth Family Centre, Scotia Bank, the East Dartmouth Boys and Girls Club, and many others. And Mr. Speaker, I would ask for waiver and passage without debate.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas many young Nova Scotians are unable to pursue post-secondary education because of the increasingly high cost of tuition, which in Nova Scotia is $2,000 above the national average, and whereas Nova Scotia is the only province in Canada that does not have a dedicated, provincially funded, needs-based grants program, and whereas no qualified Nova Scotian should be denied access to post-secondary education because of their economic circumstances. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House urge the Government of Nova Scotia to establish a provincially funded, needs-based grants program complementing the existing federal Millennium Scholarship Program so that Nova Scotians who seek a post-secondary education have the necessary resources to do so. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver. Here are no. No's is tabled. The honourable Minister of the Environment and Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Caledonia's family-owned business, Van Dykes, was honored at the 21st Annual Export Achievement Awards this past May, and whereas for 21 years the Nova Scotia Export Achievement Awards have honored pioneering companies whose creativity, innovation, and determination have made them international success stories, and whereas located in Caledonia for more than 40 years, the Van Dykes flagship product, 100% wild blueberry juice, along with other high-quality products.
Very noisy in here tonight. The honourable Minister of the Environment and Labour.
Whereas located in Caledonia for more than 40 years, the Van Dykes flagship product, 100% wild blueberry juice, along with other high-quality products, have close to doubled their out-of-province exports for 2003-2004, making inroads in Ontario, Quebec, and Western Canada. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Van Dykes of Caledonia on their award and wish them many more years of future success and prosperity. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favour say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. Honourable member for Halifax Atlantic.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN celebrated World Food Day a few days ago, October 16th, marking agriculture as not only a way of life but also as a heritage and as a cultural identity. And whereas many Nova Scotian farmers work hard at producing their agricultural products, but face tremendous adversity in keeping up their traditional way of life due to lack of access to provincial institutions. And whereas this government has long promised Nova Scotia farmers a buy local program that would see Nova Scotia produced agricultural products being served in our provincial institutions, therefore be it resolved that this government stop ploughing Nova Scotia money into foreign fields and finally deliver on its promises for a buy local program that will see a real preference given to Nova Scotia products in Nova Scotia institutions. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver and passage without debate.
Mr. Waiver, here no. Notice is table. The honourable member for Kings West.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the United Nations has marked October 17th, the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty, and 2005 as the year to focus on the fight against global poverty, and whereas every day 30,000 children die due to causes directly related to poverty, and 800 million people are chronically hungry and malnourished around the world, and whereas 189 heads of states and governments have created a partnership to fight extreme poverty and achieve real improvements in all countries, therefore, be it resolved that members of the House of Assembly recognize October 17, 2005 as the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty and applaud the efforts of the United Nations and individuals who strive to make poverty a matter of the past. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Question waivers are agreed. All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Albert McNutt of Truro has received the prestigious award for action on HIV/AIDS and human rights from the Legal Network and the New York-based Human Rights Watch, and whereas the award recognizes an individual or organization that has led the struggle against HIV/AIDS while also fighting for the advancement of human rights, and whereas Albert McNutt was a leading player in the successful fight to award survivor benefits to those who have lost a same-sex partner, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Albert McNutt on receiving an award for action on HIV/AIDS and human rights, thank him for his efforts to educate young people and others who are vulnerable to HIV/AIDS, and for his continuing fight against discrimination against those living with AIDS. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Mr. Waivers are agreed. All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas many volunteers in the town of Pictou worked very hard to organize and make the first annual Children's Wish fundraiser on September 11th a whopping success, and whereas activities included entertainment, face painting, ice cream cones, skateboarding demonstrations, games for children, an antique car show, and a car wash by the Pictou Youth Center, and whereas more than $2,200 was raised to assist granting a wish for a sick child through the Children's Wish Foundation, therefore be resolved that this Nova Scotia Legislature congratulate the organizers of the Pictou's first successful Children's Wish fundraiser and wish them continued success in future years. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver and passage without debate.
Waivers are agreed. All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Jeffrey Degas of New Edinburgh represented Nova Scotia at the 5-pin Youth Bowling Championship in Surrey, British Columbia this past May, and whereas Jeffrey took home a silver medal from this national championship, which equals his silver medal from last year's events, and whereas in the past 3 years Jeffrey has placed in the top 5 in the national championship, therefore it be resolved that members of this House congratulate Jeffrey Degas for his ongoing success at the National 5-Pin Youth Bowling Championship and wish him continued success in the future. Mr. Speaker, I would ask for waiver of notice, please.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Cape Breton Island is a destination for tourists traveling with
paragliders, and hang gliders. And whereas towing behind a vehicle is one way of getting into the air and a standard method of gaining altitude, but it is more demanding of a skill level to undertake a tow. And whereas proper training is vital for pilots, and the safety record in Canada this year has not been a good year with fatalities across the country. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House encourage the Nova Scotia Department of Transportation and Public Works to collaborate with Transport Canada and the Transportation Safety Board in an effort to develop and enforce safety regulations for this sport, making it mandatory that all new gliders attend a certified paragliding or hang gliding school. And Mr. Speaker, I would ask for a waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Question for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Dartmouth South, Portland Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Caregivers Nova Scotia is a province-wide non-profit organization dedicated to providing information and practical supports for caregivers. And whereas Caregivers Nova Scotia recently created a new position of Caregiver Support Coordinator to provide information and practical supports to family caregivers. And whereas Fiona Haysom will be a welcome resource and a sympathetic ear to people across the province who are caring for a loved one who is ill or disabled. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the legislature congratulate Caregivers Nova Scotia on their continued and expanded role as a support network and voice for family caregivers in this province. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Question for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Mary Ann McLeod, a resident of Marion Bridge, Cape Breton, was born on September 20th, 1905 in North Ramboys, Richmond County, and whereas Mary Ann raised 14 children and has 26 grandchildren, 33 great-grandchildren, and 2 great-great-grandchildren, and whereas family and friends gathered to celebrate Mary Ann's 100th birthday celebration on September 17, 2005 at the St. Columba's Presbyterian Church Hall, Marion Bridge. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Mary Ann McLeod on her 100th birthday and wish her continued health and happiness for many years to come. And Mr. Speaker, I would ask for a waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Question for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Kimberley Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. Order, please. That's how members take their seats, please. The honourable member for Kimberley Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll be asking for waiver and passage without debate. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Wayne Blackburn has given 30 years of valuable service to the Lakeside Fire Department, and was throughout these years of dedication, Wayne has demonstrated an exemplary approach to his responsibilities as a member of the fire service. Whereas Wayne Blackburn's accomplishments were recognized in a celebration at the Lakeside Fire Hall on Saturday, September 17th. Therefore, be it resolved that the Nova Scotia Legislature congratulate and thank Wayne Blackburn for his commitment to our community with wishes of good luck in his future endeavors. I ask for a waiver and passage without debate, Mr. Speaker.
Question for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Sackville Canoe Club for over 24 years has provided spring, summer, and fall programs on canoeing and kayaking to the youth and adults of Lower Sackville. And whereas there is an emphasis placed on water and boat safety, as well as other elements of leadership, competitive activities, and personal growth. And whereas many club paddlers showed determination and great sense of pride for their province and canoe club at this year's nationals. Therefore, be it resolved that members of the Nova Scotia Legislature extend congratulations to all members of the Sackville team who went to the nationals with an outstanding showing, as well as being great ambassadors for not only Nova Scotia but Sackville and the Sackville Canoe Club. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Question for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion's carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton Nova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas this past Friday, 40 workers at the Clearwater Processing Plant in North Sydney received their layoff notices, putting their financial well-being of many Cape Breton families in peril. And whereas successful Liberal and Conservative governments have failed to protect the rights of local fishing communities and their processors. And whereas Nova Scotia has lost over 3,000 fish processing jobs between 1991 and 2001, and the losses on Friday point to this being a continued trend. Therefore, be it resolved, this House recognize those working in all levels of the fishing industry should no longer have their livelihoods and economic well-being put in jeopardy by failed public policies of previous Liberal and Conservative governments.
Notice is tabled. The honourable member Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Canada Games provides a positive environment that offers fulfillment, cultivates new friendship, and fosters leadership through development in sport. And whereas the competitive sports brings out the best in athletic achievement, both individually or working together as a team. And whereas in this competitive environment of athletics, success is achieved through passion and commitment to the sport. And Daniel Marks proved this by winning the gold in the men's C200, the silver in the men's C4 1000, and the bronze in the men's C1 200. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the Nova Scotia Legislative Assembly show their appreciation of Daniel Marks' outstanding athletic performance on behalf of all Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Community Service on the introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And yes, this is an introduction. We have a familiar face and a friend to this House here in the East Gallery here this evening. And I'd like to introduce Marianne McGrath to the House. And she is now the newly nominated candidate for the PC Party for Halifax Clayton Park.
Welcome, Marianne, to the gallery this evening. Hope she enjoys the proceedings. The honourable member Co-Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move in the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas students at Co-Harbour District High School have formed the Social Justice Group to promote awareness of important issues such as fair trade, global warming, poverty, and human rights, both among students and the community as a whole. Whereas a No Sweat campaign has begun at Co-Harbour District High School to ensure all clothes purchased by and for the school are manufactured under safe and healthy conditions. Whereas Co-Harbour District High School has a successful youth health center known as the Cavway to help inform students with regard to various health issues facing youth. Therefore, be it resolved that this House congratulate Co-Harbour District High School and those students at the school who are trying to make a difference in their world, both locally and globally. And I ask for waiver, Mr. Speaker.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member of Cape Breton Nova. Cape Breton Nova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 1 in every 166 children is diagnosed with autism, and whereas autism is the fastest growing childhood disability in Canada, where the rate is rising steadily. And whereas on October 8, 2005, families from near and far assembled on the boardwalk in Sydney, Nova Scotia to walk for autism awareness. Therefore, be it resolved, the members of the Legislative Assembly acknowledge the Autism Society of Cape Breton for its ongoing efforts in helping improve the quality of life for those Cape Breton families who must face autism on a daily basis. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request waivers is agreed. All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. Now, member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas education is said to be the great equalizer and is the basis for improving one's life chances for good health, employment, and longevity, and whereas governments from all levels have a vital role to play in poverty eradication through policy which addresses income and social security, education, housing, and health care, And whereas inexplicably the current Nova Scotia government has put in place barriers to higher education for those in receipt of social assistance, contributing to an ongoing cycle of poverty for many families. Therefore, be it resolved that we remind the members of the government party on this day, the International Day for the Elimination of Poverty, that through their actions they have contributed to the ongoing cycle of poverty for many Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, I seek waiver and passage without debate.
Hearing no, notice is tabled. The honourable member for Dartmouth South, Portland Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the HRM Federation of Community Agencies had its founding meeting September 30th, and whereas both individuals and organizations recognize the need to work collectively on the challenge facing their nonprofit agencies, and whereas governments, communities, and families depend heavily on their essential social programs and services as part of the social safety net in this region of the province. Therefore, be it resolved that the Nova Scotia House of Assembly recognize the valuable work of the members of the HRM Federation of Community Agencies, congratulate the Federation organizers and members, and pledge to support its collaborative work. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Mr. Waiver, is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Timberlea Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas residents of the Beachfield, Lakeside, and Timberlake communities have reached out to help 17-year-old Nicole Lee and her family as they face the medical challenges ahead. Whereas the community has been raising funds for Nicole, and whereas Larry and Jackie Sampson organized a bike, run, walkathon along the BLT rails to trails that raised over $13,000. Therefore, be it resolved that the House of Assembly congratulate and thank Jackie and Larry Sampson and all involved in the continuing efforts to raise funds for Nicole Lee. I ask for a waiver and passage without debate, Mr. Speaker.
Waivers are agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move adoption of the following resolution. Whereas rowing is a sport that makes a big splash in Nova Scotia, whereas Ms. Tracy Cameron of Shubenacadie took up the sport relatively late in life but quickly achieved a spot on Canada's national rowing team. And whereas on September 4, 2005, Ms. Cameron and her crewmates struck gold in the lightweight women's quad event at the FISA World Rowing Championships in Gifu, Japan. Therefore, be resolved, this House of Assembly congratulate Tracy Cameron and her teammates on their gold medals and wish them similar success in future events. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Canada Games provides a positive environment that offers fulfillment, cultivates new friendship, and fosters leadership through the development of sports, and whereas the competitive sports brings out the best in athletic achievement, both individually or working together as a team. And whereas this competitive environment of athletic success is achieved through a passion and commitment to the sport. And
order, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will just go partially, Mr. Speaker. It is achieved through passion and commitment to the sport, and whereas Maria Halavresos proved this by winning gold in the women's C2 6,000 and silver in the women's C2 500. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the Nova Scotia Legislative Assembly show their appreciation of Maria Halavresos' outstanding athletic performance on behalf of all Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers is agreed. Agreed. All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas a few short weeks ago I yet again paid $50 to register my youngest son at our local high school. And whereas some parents have had to dole out over $100 for this registration that can include lockers, agendas, and such, and whereas although as parents and guardians we do what we can to help fundraise whenever possible throughout the school year, therefore be it resolved that the Department of Education stop using this hidden fundraiser and start funding rather than underfunding our children's school system in this province. And I request waiver and passage without debate.
There's a waiver. There's several noes. Notice table. Orders Day Government Business, Honourable Government House Leader.
Speaker, would you please call the order of business public bills for second reading?
Public bills for second reading.
Mr. Speaker, would you please call Bill 222, Tobacco Damages and Health Care Cost Recovery Act?
Bill number 222, the honourable member for Timberlea Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, first of all, I want you to know that I took my homework home over the weekend, and I want to thank the member from Halifax Needham. I'm going to refer to this book a number of times, but I'm not going to table it. But I want members opposite to know that this would be a very appropriate book for any of them to read when it comes to the title of the Canadian Tobacco War. It's a very much a think piece by Rob Cunningham, and the title is Smoke and Mirrors. So I want to thank the member from Halifax Needham for that book. And perhaps I can table that section that I'm going to be quoting from as I begin my comments on Bill 222. It seems to me, Mr. Speaker, that if I look at these opening comments, I want to read this into the record, and then I want, if you're interested, members opposite, to guess what particular year these arguments were made. And so I will begin with this. Doctors and health organizations decry the harm caused by tobacco use and demand that the government impose tough regulations to control the tobacco industry. Tobacco manufacturers and farmers oppose regulation, arguing that there is no proof that smoking is harmful, that government intervention in the marketplace is unjustified, that regulation will cost jobs and hurt the economy, and finally, that there is no proof that regulation will accomplish the intended objectives. The year, Mr. Speaker, was 1903. 1903, that was an argument being made public to make sure that Canada was considering the banning of tobacco. 1903. Now let me tell you, Mr. Speaker, there is no industry in this country that has reinvented itself in so many ways than the Canadian tobacco industry. If you look through this book in certain places, it's always interesting to look at how advertising has changed over the years when it comes to smoking. And it's quite a history lesson. It is quite a history lesson. You know, you can see the endorsements, you can see the very attractive young women who are brought in to, of all things, sell Craven A. What an appropriate name for cigarettes of the day. Craven A. And then there is, in one of those particular ads, the fact, of course, that the men going to war were in need of cigarettes and the donation should be made. Now, Mr. Speaker, as you well know, I'm the proud son of a veteran who landed at Normandy, who helped liberate Holland. But let me tell you that the cigarettes that my father smoked for years eventually took his life. Took his life. And let me know, I want you to know, Mr. Speaker, that is the reason that I have never had a smoke. And I don't consider that to be righteous. I'm not better than members opposite. For various reasons, people or members of this side of the House have decided that they are going to have a smoke. But I want to point out to you, Mr. Speaker, my fear with tobacco is this is a 1903 argument, but this is the year 2005. I was visiting one of my local high schools, I shouldn't say it that way, one of our local high schools today. And they were just changing classes. And what shocked me again, they come off the school grounds, they're allowed that in high school, of course, right? They come off the school grounds and they have a cigarette. And the disproportionate number of young women that are still smoking. And so I parked my vehicle, walked up through them, and I must admit, I said to them, this is a healthy way to enjoy a nice fall day in Canada. I mean, some of them knew who I was, some of them didn't appreciate my sarcasm, but Mr. Speaker, this problem has not gone away. This problem has not gone away. This industry has reinvented itself so many ways and in so many situations that we continually face the issue as parents, as school teachers, and you in your previous position as a law enforcement officer, to at times apply laws that we knew just could not be taken care of. And I can use this for an example, Mr. Speaker, because I've been put in this situation in a previous career where a young woman was writing an exam. And during the exam, she asked to go to the washroom. Now, the teacher said, and incidentally, this was at a very prominent high school in the community of Lower Sackville, where the young man from Sackville-Cobequid was not present that day, let me tell you. The teacher followed the student a couple of minutes later into the washroom, saying to the student, "Is there a problem?" And what was this young woman doing? She was having a cigarette. In the middle of the exam, she was stressed out and she needed a smoke. So the teacher called me, not into the girls' washroom now, be careful. The teacher called me into the situation, brought the girl out with the cigarette. We came down to my office and I said to her, "I'm going to have to send you home for a couple of days." I had to have a cigarette. I just had to have a cigarette in the middle of her chemistry exam. I mean, she wanted to know about nicotine. I guess she could learn firsthand. I must admit, Mr. Speaker, I let her finish the exam. She finished it in my office, in fact. But I did suspend her. And when I suspended her, and here's the case that I want to bring to your attention. She was a girl in grade 11, so she'd be probably, 17 at the time? And when I suspended the girl for having a cigarette in the middle of her chemistry exam in grade 11, her mother said to me, "What's the big deal? I let her smoke at home with me." Now there's the problem we deal with. There's the problem. We can make all the laws, we can have all the judicial decisions, we can have all the input from the health authorities, we can hear from Doctors Nova Scotia, from Clean Nova Scotia, we can hear from whatever experts. Excuse me, Mr. Speaker. I must have been at the same party that the member from Inverness was, because I have the same problem that he does, and I can sing in English and he must have been singing in Gaelic. Mr. Speaker, I want to point out to you the problem with legislation and the problem with involving court cases when it comes to this particular issue. It comes down to social values. You know, Mr. Speaker, I can tell you, in future years, will it be acceptable for young men and women to have a smoke? Will it be an issue of social prominence or will it not? This particular piece of legislation, of course, has the support of this caucus, and we're looking forward to going through law amendments. But it will not, this piece of legislation will take much more when it comes to implementation. There will be appeals, probably. There will be questions about constitutionality. Lawyers will continue to make more and more money off of this case and the decision that is forthcoming. This particular piece of legislation has to send a clear message to Canadians and to Nova Scotians in the example of our province. And to the minister opposite, I congratulate him for bringing him forward. But we have many long battles and many struggles ahead. So with those few comments, Mr. Speaker, I look forward to bringing forward this bill to law amendments. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Preston.
Thank you very much. It's this, I believe, is the right step forward by the government to hold the tobacco companies accountable for some of the costs. And I'm going to relate a personal story on tobacco. And it's difficult for me to do, but about a year ago, my wife was diagnosed with breast cancer. Now, for the past 16 years, she hadn't smoked. Prior to that, she smoked 3 packs a day. Now, I don't know, there's no way of ever knowing, if that smoking was cause of the breast cancer. And it's only by luck that she went for her first mammogram ever and found a small lump in her breast that couldn't be detected any other way. And by the time they operated 4 weeks later, it had grown to almost 10 times the original size. Now, that's a personal story. My father died from leukemia. My father-in-law died from lung cancer, both of them smokers. My mother died from cancer from secondhand smoke, I'm sure, or as a result of some things to do with that. And it's time that the tobacco companies were held accountable for these things. And I'm just one family. I'm sure there's every family in Nova Scotia can tell a similar story. I hope not, but they probably can. Even if this isn't successful, even if we never get a penny from the tobacco companies, if we can bring enough attention to this to prevent people from starting up smoking, one child, it's worth every minute and every hour we spend on this in this legislature, and every hour and every dollar the province spends on preventing people from getting cancer. And I've seen the movies when I was growing up with the lungs filled with the black tar and all the other things, and there's only finding out now that the secondhand smoke was so bad. I can remember going to facilities and there was so much smoke and dances and stuff you couldn't breathe. Luckily, I've never smoked myself. After growing up with a father that smoked in the car, cigarettes and cigars and pipe, I decided that maybe it's not such a good thing to do. Lucky for me that I didn't start. And hopefully there's a lot of people out there that make that decision on an ongoing basis. It's a difficult thing. I've heard the stories about people how it's more difficult to quit smoking than it is to quit some of the hard drugs on the market. That's a pretty scary thing when you think about it. And it's time that these guys are held accountable. There's no need to smoke. There's absolutely no need to smoke. Oftentimes people say that there is, my rights and freedoms, I have the right to smoke. You may have the right to smoke, but you don't have the right to jeopardize anyone else's health, and you don't have the right to put a heavy burden on our healthcare system that can be avoided simply by not doing something. Simply by not doing something. I remember all the debates about non-smoking legislation, and we're going to be talking about that in the future, in the past, about the rights and a few people complaining about it. I wonder if those people that complained about it several years ago have any side effects from the smoking now. I wonder if they've contracted cancer or some other disease from smoking. Hopefully they haven't, but probably some of them have. And it goes on and on. So I commend the government for moving forward on this. I think we should have moved forward on this a lot sooner. Unfortunately, we had to have a court case in BC to get the legitimate go-ahead on this, and I think that's very positive. And I commend British Columbia for doing that and moving this issue forward. It's a difficult situation when you're talking about suing the big tobacco companies. They'll do everything they possibly can to ensure they don't have to pay any bills. And then eventually, hopefully, they'll all go out of business so there won't be any product to sell. And that would be sort of a nice scenario. I'm sure, though, that people like to smoke. It's like when they had prohibition with alcohol in the 30s, and in those years, there was always some place to get the product, and the more counterband there is there, the more likely there is to be a market for it. I know there was, in HRM, when I was a regional councillor, we passed some anti-smoking laws that started the process, but there needs to be more work done, and this may be the way to do it. I know the federal government has stopped advertising with tobacco. That's a help. It all helps. And the attitude of people, I know I said in this legislature over 10 years ago, and we talked about anti-smoking laws, and at that time it wasn't acceptable. And today it's very acceptable. People's attitudes have changed, and slowly will change as time goes on. And you can imagine the cost to the family and the healthcare system, and to the family and the pain. I know what my family has gone through with these terrible things that people say they enjoy so much. And when it really comes down to it, my wife, after smoking 3 packs a day, she goes in a room now where people are smoking, she has to leave. She gets so filled up and really upset. It's a good thing that she reacted like that. If it wouldn't have been for that reaction, she might have started smoking again, which I wouldn't want to think about. And if she would indeed be with us today if she had continued smoking. So I want to commend the government for bringing this bill forward and look forward to the day that we can collect a pile of money from the tobacco companies and put it to good use in prevention and cures for these terribly horrible diseases that affect so many families in Nova Scotia. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. recognize the honourable member for Halifax Atlantic.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have to say, I've rarely had the opportunity to speak to a bill that pleased me so very, very much. Like most Nova Scotians, it sounds as though, like a lot of people in this room, I have been directly affected by tobacco. The first encounter that I would have had was the stories of a grandfather I never met, who apparently in 1952, while dying of emphysema and living in what was called an oxygen tent, said, "Show me the proof that tobacco causes any of this and I will stop immediately." I don't know how many people before and since have said exactly that. However, the proof has been there for a very long time. The proof was there when my father died of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and heart disease. And many of my father's last years were spent in hospital rooms with other patients with serious heart disease who had all stopped smoking but had spent large portions of their previous lives smoking. And those people, those who have not died, are still living rather lingering and uncomfortable, unpleasant lives. And those who have died have left behind a great deal of sorrow. This is no accident. Ever since tobacco was first imported to Europe, it has been a popular and known to be a highly addictive drug. If you look at the songs of the temperance movement and some of the religious tracts of the 18th and 19th centuries, they're decrying tobacco, sometimes with humor and often with a great deal of bitterness. It was understood to be a problem then. Those who use the weed, I think, is the phrase that often smokers were referred to as. So why does it persist? It isn't any accident. At the moment, tobacco sales account for almost $9.8 billion a year. That's more than the gross national product of many countries on this earth. And those tobacco markets are cultivated. In fact, sometimes the illegal markets are cultivated where necessary. Imperial Tobacco recently was charged with deliberately fostering a black market in its product in order to circumvent taxation. And smokers, in the face of this, are not people we can consider weak. They are people that we can consider victims. There are some 200 chemical additives in any modern cigarette filter. And there are, in fact, rumors that some of those are even more addictive than the drug nicotine. Those rumors have not been proven because the contents of a modern cigarette are a closely, closely, closely guarded secret. An interesting side effect of that, or sidelight on that, is the fact that 2 years ago, the psychiatric analysts reported that 44% of the cigarettes smoked in North America, this was only 2 years ago, 44% of the cigarettes smoked on any given day on this continent are smoked by people who have suffered a psychiatric ailment within the preceding 30 days. And it's highly correlated with the later development of depression and mental illness. The younger people begin to use nicotine. It's estimated as well that approximately 250 million children alive today will die prematurely of the effects of tobacco. That doesn't even account for the impact on children who are not yet alive today. The children who may not die of the effects of tobacco, but whose lives may be seriously compromised by the effects of low birth weight, because they're the children not only of mothers who smoke, but children whose mothers are in households filled with smoke. Even if it doesn't come to that, I know that there are such things as veterinary health insurance, but I'm not sure whether that actually covers the effects on pug-nosed dogs and some of the short-nosed breeds of cats, who are particularly prone to asthma in smoking households. Children, of course, are also impacted, and we have very, very high rates of asthma wherever smoking takes place, as well as, of course, other airborne pollutants. I had the experience recently of looking for a hotel room, however, and it was a very heartening thing, because hotels where I was looking to stay were just about all full. It was a long weekend, everybody had gone shopping. It was very hard to find a room. I stopped in 3 different places, and I was told, yes, there were rooms left, smoking rooms. Nobody wanted them. And that is really, really heartening. I didn't want those rooms either. I decided I'd rather sleep in the car than sleep in one of those rooms. I think the estimate that the sign they put in the hotel room is they'll charge $250 to $300 to try and purge the place. In any case, that $9.8 billion a year market is benefiting some entities, and it does produce work. It certainly produces work in the tobacco industry, it produces work in the corner stores, it produces work in the casinos, it produces work in bars, and it produces work in hospitals. It produces work as well in the other pharmaceutical industries. But when 45,000 Canadians every year die as a result of a very small portion of that $9.8 billion a year market, and many others are left suffering from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, from heart disease, from cancer of various sorts, then we have to wonder, is there any portion of that market that could possibly justify the costs which are being foisted upon our society? My answer to that is no. There is absolutely no portion of that market that could ever justify such a thing. And this is one of the most right things that we as a legislature could be doing, is to put just some of the financial costs, let alone those unrecoverable emotional, psychological, and social costs, to try and push at least some of those financial costs back on those who have deliberately and cynically been inflicting them on this nation and others over the past 100 years. Mr. Speaker, thank you very much.
Thank you. Recognize the honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to speak for a few moments on Bill number 222, which I consider to be, I think, a watershed event in the history of dealing with and providing a basis of attacking the very fundamental area of the problem, and that is the tobacco companies themselves. So I think moving forward in this area is a very, very positive step for this province, and one which certainly our party supports. I'd like to just draw reference to a little bit of statistical data to start out with, and this is based on cancer statistics in Nova Scotia for the year 2000. And we obviously know that the major connection with smoking is indeed with lung cancer. And lung cancer was the leading type of cancer-related deaths, accounting for 33% of cancer deaths in males, 23% of cancer deaths in females. And both cancer incidence and mortality rates were consistently higher for males over the past 28 years, and a pattern driven by lung cancer. And of course, the very, very dismal statistics are on the side of the survival rates. For a 5-year period, were highest for patients diagnosed with prostate or breast cancer, but survival rates for those with lung cancer are extremely low. 13% in males, 15% in females for those who have lung cancer. And of course, we all know that a very disturbing trend in our society, and certainly here in Nova Scotia, is the increase among females. And as a former teacher, vice principal, this was one of the certainly very noticeable trends during the 90s in particular, and carrying on into 2000. And so we know at this time that in fact, again, the statistical picture which we have in that regard, the overall increase in the rates of cancer incidence among females is largely driven by the rising incidence of lung malignancies. And between 1984 and 1999, the rates of lung cancer increased on the average 3.6% annually, and they showed the highest rate of increases of all cancers diagnosed among women. So certainly that trend, which started during the post-war period, in fact, has increased pretty dramatically. One of the things, however, that even the current government must take a look at is the amount of revenue that comes from the sale of cigarettes, which is in the vicinity of $180 million, I think $178 million in the last year. So we see a very, very small amount of that going back into the health promotion area. So that's one step that, as we put this piece of legislation forward, we could be very proactive on the side of taking more of that tax revenue and putting it into the fight, especially among, I think, our upper elementary and junior high school age group, where we see, of course, the initiation of smoking habits. So that's one of the, I think, in the short term. I think in the long term, obviously, if we're able to gain significant revenue from this legal case against the tobacco companies, obviously Nova Scotians need to have a plan for where that money will be spent in the fight, of course, against cancer and against lung cancer in particular, which is a significant problem in our province. So certainly, Mr. Speaker, I look forward to hearing from those who will appear before law amendments, and hopefully the case in support of the government's legislation will be exceptionally strong, and the legal team developing the plan for moving this forward will certainly receive strong support. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Recognize the member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I rise to speak on Bill 222, an act to recover damages and health care costs from manufacturers of tobacco. Mr. Speaker, I would imagine that if I had walked into this legislative assembly some 20 years ago, I would have seen a huge number of people smoking, and probably the air was wafting in blue, not just simply by verbal consternation among the members of the Legislative Assembly, but actual and real visible evidence of smoking cigarettes. I'm not sure if that was the case, but I can assure you that it's far significantly more than the numbers that we have here today. And I think that that's a testament to the ongoing tobacco industry and the health profession, particularly the health profession, and working very closely to make sure that the cessation of smoking was in fact a priority among all Canadians across this province. I do know that this piece of legislation is a piece of legislation that was originally brought in from the province of British Columbia. I also know that this was a Supreme Court challenge, and that this piece of legislation stood the test of the Supreme Court challenge, which allowed the province of British Columbia to bring in this piece of legislation. And also that, in fact, the province of Nova Scotia has now brought forward the same piece of legislation, or similar to that piece of legislation from the province of British Columbia. And it's great to see members of the Legislative Assembly whom, in fact, recognize a good piece of legislation and will support that legislation. My guess is, Mr. Speaker, that when this piece of legislation crosses the legislative floor into the Red Room, there will be very few presenters to this piece of legislation. I think that this is a piece of legislation that has had significant consultation. It has significant consultation both with the health professionals provincially and on a federal level. And I think it's time for us to send a signal to the tobacco industry of just how difficult it is for people who have taken up smoking, and that the industry knowingly manufactured a product that was highly addictive and damaging to one's health. And for that very reason, Mr. Speaker, they should be held accountable. And this piece of legislation makes them held accountable. Mr. Speaker, I've been a reformed smoker. Actually, I gave up smoking some 18 years ago. And I have to tell you that it was a constant reminder by my wife about the health effects that smoking would have, and that it certainly wasn't healthy around my children and so on. And her constant badgering of me to quit smoking finally made me realize the kind of health problems that come with smoking cigarettes. So I have to say that I gave up smoking primarily because there was a constant reminder by my family members that this was not the appropriate thing to do. And I can tell you, fortunately, that family members often emulate what you do. And I can say today that no member of my family smoke, which is one of the attributes of not smoking. We've often heard of the number of individuals. I've heard from my colleague from Halifax Needham who cited a number of statistical data and information that 45,000 Canadians die as a result of tobacco use annually across the country. We've heard statistical information from other members of this Legislative Assembly with respect to the percentage of lung cancer and so on that happens, the results of emphysema and pulmonary disabilities as a result of smoking. I remember quite clearly once when I visited a palliative care unit in one of the local hospitals. And in that palliative care unit at that particular time, this was a few years back, Mr. Speaker, when an individual who was dying on the bed was still struggling to have that last cigarette. And to me, that was clear evidence that it was time to give up smoking. Now, there are many citizens in our society who think that smoking doesn't have an effect on their health, and some people live long lives without encountering some of those difficulties that come along with smoking. But they're very few and far between. I do think that although this piece of legislation just is working towards, recovering the damages of health care costs, I think there also should be room to cause the government to implement legislation that if individuals are prepared for a cessation of smoking or to quit smoking, that in fact the government caused the tobacco industry to provide a smoking cessation program, and that it be paid for by the tobacco industry if in fact it can be identified that the tobacco industry is a result of that person's needing to quit smoking, which obviously it would be. The issue of secondhand smoke, now I do recall approximately about a year and a half ago or 2 years ago, there was a lady in Winnipeg, I believe her name was Helen Crow, I will say Miss Crow, who was a waitress in a Ottawa restaurant, whom in fact never smoked a cigarette in her life, and who encountered cancer, lung cancer, as a result of workplace employment. That individual made an attempt to sue the tobacco industry, but was a lone individual, and the cost was just simply too much. It was discovered that, in fact, this was a workplace illness, and it was picked up by the Workers' Compensation Board. I would say to the Workers' Compensation Board in any province across this country that if, in fact, individuals are paid by taxpayers and corporations dollars whose direct result of illness was because of tobacco-related industries, that they should take up the charge and move forward and create some legislation that will, in fact, cause the tobacco industry, if it can be proven, to, in fact, compensate the individuals rather than that money come out of the Workers' Compensation Board. I'm not a lawyer. I don't profess to be a lawyer, but I do know that the legal language, and a good point, might never, at this particular point, never want to be a lawyer. However, I would say that putting the legal minds together could certainly craft the same kind of legislation here that would cause the tobacco industry to rethink its commitment to a healthy, safe workplace, and that it is obligated to fund individuals whom, in fact, have been who have lost their employment as a result of secondhand smoke. And that's the kind of thing that we simply take for granted. Many of us have gone into pubs, bars, belong to entertainments, rather a dart organization, a pool organization, or whatever the case may be, and we've walked into Legion's bingo halls. I have been in bingo halls where there was nothing but smoke. It was a matter of having to cut the air before you went in order to find a place to sit down. Those things, fortunately, have changed. People now have the opportunity to work in a healthy environment, and I do know that that piece of legislation is coming forward, Mr. Speaker. I do know that we will be dealing with smoking legislation in the next few days, but I do want to say that the Minister of Justice, the Minister of Health, the Minister of Health Promotions, all who have worked in crafting this piece of legislation, Bill 222, should recognize that they have done a great thing, not only for the people of Nova Scotia, but in carrying the banner with British Columbia, the other province that I do know who is tracking this, and hopefully other provinces will come on stream. So, Mr. Speaker, with those short comments, I, like others, will in fact wait for this bill to come across the leave this legislative assembly, go into the Red Room, not seeing much debate on it. I think that this will be a speedy bill return for approval by this legislature and royal assent. With those few words, Mr. Speaker, I appreciate having the opportunity to speak on this bill.
Recognize the honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll be brief because many of the points that I wanted to make have been made, and I know there's a rule of repetition in the House, and many of the members that have spoken have made some excellent points. Speaking about repetition, Mr. Speaker, we can hear some from down in Timberley Prospect. Mr. Speaker, there are a couple points that I wanted to raise with regards to Bill 222. First, I would like to acknowledge and congratulate the government for bringing this bill forward, because it's a very positive and constructive piece of legislation for the people of Nova Scotia. But, Mr. Speaker, at the same time, I'm a little perplexed as to why the federal government has not stepped up to the plate on this very issue. I recall when a former Minister of Health, the Honourable Dave Dingwall, had made some rather significant gains in addressing the issue of smoking in Canada, and he made some changes to the Canada Health Act through the government of the day. And he stood up to the large tobacco companies, and I thought that was a very positive initiative for all Canadians. But yet the provinces seem to be forced to take the leadership role on this particular issue, and I'm a little disappointed because the federal government has deep pockets, it has the resources, and the legal infrastructure, and the ability to mount a rather forceful litigation against the tobacco companies, the international tobacco companies. So I wanted to put that on there because here in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, as you know, in my constituency, we have the First Nations community of Eskasoni, and I'm quite impressed with all the initiatives that have been undertaken by the chief and the local band council in addressing many of the alcohol and drug problems in Eskasoni. But yet, we as a government in the province of Nova Scotia don't seem to be able to do anything with the fact that tobacco is being sold in the First Nations communities. Now there's a proposal, I understand, to open another venue in Membertou, and that's great. That's good to be able to see the First Nations communities become economically and socially self-sustaining. I think that's great. However, I'm somewhat amazed, Mr. Speaker, with all the critics
with all the critics that I see and hear on a daily basis about the fact that tobacco is so easily and readily available to people that want to, from the non-native community, that can go to the native reserves and buy tobacco at a reduced rate. They are the same ones that I hear criticizing day in and day out, but yet they'll be the same ones to go and partake in that particular exercise. So I think the federal government has a responsibility to stand up to the plate and help the First Nations communities and all the other communities across Canada in dealing with this issue, not only in terms of supporting the provincial governments with this litigation, and this legislation will certainly provide and strengthen a legal framework to make that happen, but surely, if we're going to have a level playing field, whether it be in the fisheries, whether it be any type of economic or social development, then the federal government has to stand up to the plate. The provincial government does not have the legal authority, in many cases, to deal with these issues. And recently, the First Nations community, I believe Chief Paul, has indicated that they don't have to listen to what the provincial government says on this particular issue. It may be a shame, but it's a realization of the two different scales on which we measure our economic and social independence. And I'm very proud of the fact that they've made some significant strides here in Nova Scotia, because I've seen it happen in other parts of Canada, northern Manitoba, British Columbia, and so on, where the First Nations communities have really turned things around from what was once perceived, whether it be real or apparent. It's still a perception there that was there for the longest time of this social dependence. And that is now being put to sleep because they have decided to take a leadership role. So I think it's fair for the provincial government here to ask the federal government to step up to the plate, because British Columbia is doing it, Nova Scotia is doing it, other provinces are doing it. Where is the federal government? And I think that's a fair question. Mr. Speaker, we know that smoking today is not as acceptable as it was 20, 30, 50, even 100 years ago. I mean, when Sir Walter Raleigh came to West Virginia, bringing tobacco over, and that's, as I recall, the first introduction, I mean, that was the big thing. And all of a sudden, it became an industry. It became part of society. Everybody accepted it. And it was socially acceptable to go into an environment where perhaps upwards of 30 or 40% of the people in the room were smoking. So you were the minority if you were a non-smoker, even though in reality you were a majority, and you still had to accept that. And times have changed. They've changed on alcohol and driving. They've changed on many social issues, Mr. Speaker. When I was first elected to the House of Assembly here, you go into the washroom. Well, I can't speak for the ladies' washroom, but in the men's washroom, they had actual ashtrays in each of the stalls for the men. They had ashtrays so they could go and carry their smoke with them. Now, Mr. Speaker, that's not acceptable anymore. And I'm sure that's the same in many, many institutions. I'm reading this particular annual report from Imperial Tobacco, the latest one that was just put out, updated 2004. And I was particularly observant to their mission statement, which says, "Our mission statement is to compete successfully for market share in any market we enter by satisfying adult smoker preferences better than the competition. This will be done in a manner that is profitable, sustainable, and creates value for the company." And then, of course, Mr. Speaker, they outline all the taxes that they pay provincially and federally.
And then they go on to show how they are being so socially responsible by supporting all the different activities, for example, in the province of Nova Scotia. Well, the total net contribution to all the different arts and culture and educational programs in the province of Nova Scotia added up to $111,700 for the fiscal year of 2004. Now compare that to the number of people or the cost of health care for one person suffering from lung cancer, for example, because of smoking. And I don't, Mr. Speaker, at any point in time ever pretend to know all the cause and effect relationships or what, the actual details as to whether smoking causes cancer in certain individuals or not. My dad smoked till he was 86 years old when he died. He didn't die of cancer. So some people it affects, some people it doesn't. But we have to weigh that all out, Mr. Speaker. There are some other points that have been made that I was going to make, and I will certainly, leave those in concurrence. I certainly agree. I think the government has done the right thing in bringing this forth, and certainly will be supporting it and going on to law amendments. Thank you.
Thank you. Recognize the honourable member for Halifax, Shabukto.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Along with, I think, every other member of this House, I will be supporting the legislation. I do want to say that I'll be doing so reluctantly. I'll be doing this reluctantly because I see the bill as being a weak step. It's not something as aggressive as it might have been. And I think before I get into the details of that, we should step back and consider just how complex a problem it is that we're wrestling with and how difficult it has been for any jurisdiction in North America to come out with a coherent strategy to deal with the problems of smoking. Now, this bill, of course, focuses on what I think is an important, but in some respects also a narrow aspect of the question. It's an important one because it focuses on the money side. It looks at it and it says, how much do we as a society end up having to pay through our governments, through taxation, through dollars that people are obliged to pay to us to maintain the healthcare system due to injuries having to do with smoking? Now, that's an important question. And yet at the same time, as we're all aware, people can, and it's not illegal, grow tobacco and grow it commercially. People can sell tobacco, and that's not illegal. We know that we are about to move in the direction of a complete ban on smoking in public places. And it's a very good thing. But of course, we took a long time to get there, and we did it by steps. What I'm saying is that there's been no comprehensive anti-tobacco strategy that looks to completely eradicate it. Now, it may be that that's a necessary compromise. It may be that people are simply not willing to get rid of tobacco completely. But I think we have to face up to it, that we've been moving only step by step, and we're not moving comprehensively. Advertising is another part of it. Advertising is now, of course, essentially gone. But what worries me about this legislation is that I don't think that we will necessarily get any money out of it. And if that's the objective, then we should try to do it in an effective way. And I'm worried about it. The Honourable the Minister of Justice at second reading said, and I quote, "First of all, obviously it will hold the tobacco companies accountable for what they have done. Well, you know what? That isn't quite true. The legislation doesn't hold the tobacco companies accountable for what they have done. What this legislation does is it sets the stage for a lawsuit. Now, I've practiced law over the years, and I am no fan of lawsuits. Entering upon a lawsuit is an extremely uncertain enterprise. Most lawyers will tell their clients that. It's risky, and it's expensive, and it's time-consuming. Now, here's what this legislation says. It says that the government will consider taking a lawsuit against tobacco manufacturers, and it'll do it on the basis, if this ever goes ahead, of what are called tobacco-related wrongs. Now, the bill also sets up a 2-year time limit, but of course the 2 years don't start to run until the legislation is proclaimed. And what the Minister of Justice has also told us is that after this legislation is passed, the government will set out to do research, and to do research, as the Honourable the Minister of Justice said, quote, toward advancing our case in the courts. And ultimately, we do have to demonstrate our case in the court. Again, I say, that's the problem. What we're doing here is we're saying we're going to step back, we're going to do the research that's a necessary preliminary to a lawsuit of extreme complexity, and then, presumably when the research is ready, and the legal team is assembled, and the statisticians who are to be the expert witnesses are lined up, and the physicians are lined up, and the people from the Department of Finance are lined up, then we'll go to court. Well, perhaps the bill will be proclaimed. Well, the bill will be proclaimed, and then sometime we'll go to court and see what happens. Now, I believe the Minister of Justice also said this is likely to take years, and he's quite correct. This process that we're being invited to embrace will take very many years, and yet it's uncertain. Now, why do I say that? I say that for one reason, because of the definition of tobacco-related wrong. It relies on torts. What are torts? Torts are a mechanism devised in law to try to offer compensation, usually money, to people who have been injured in some way non-contractually. What is the kind of tort we're thinking about here? It seems to me it must be one of two things. It must either be negligence, or it must be the intentional infliction of harm. But that's a threshold question. Is it intentional or was it negligent? As I remember my tort law, you can't go to court over both, arising out of the same actions. You have to decide whether it's intentional or whether it was negligent. So right away, I foresee the possibility of confusion in the courts and perhaps a fundamental misstep in the way we have conceived this legislation, unless we take away that distinction. We could do it in the legislation if we wished. If I'm right in my recollection of how it is that this aspect of the tort system works, then I wouldn't want to see us, after years of research and preparation for a court case, obliged to choose whether it's intentional or negligent. I wouldn't like to see us lose the case if we chose the wrong one. Suppose we decide, as a result of our research, that what the tobacco manufacturers did was deliberate. And there's lots of evidence from research and published sources and from internal documents that it was probably deliberate. But suppose the judge trying the matter, or judges on appeal, decide it was more negligent than deliberate. Are we going to be out of court? I don't want us to be. So I raise this question, and I hope the Honourable the Minister of Justice will consult with his staff and think carefully about this particular point. But I have a more serious objection. And the problem I have is with the whole idea of a lawsuit at all. Never mind the uncertainties, never mind the time, although I'll get to that separately as another issue. Never mind the risk, never mind the fact that it's going to tie down a great many people for many years, apparently. If we are convinced that tobacco manufacturers have done harm, whether negligently or deliberately, but certainly culpably, to our population, and that harm has resulted in a huge drain on the public purse, why are we thinking of suing them? Why don't we send them a bill? Why don't we find some legal way to simply say to them, you owe us $100 million, $200 million, $400 million, $1 billion, $2 billion, and find a way to essentially charge the manufacturers now. The only question should be, what's the quantum? We might be prepared to discuss quantum with them, but why should we be saying, let's roll the dice and go to court? Let's have our lawyers go up against your lawyers. Let's have our experts go up against your experts. Let's take 5 or 10 years and sort this out. Why are we doing that? Is there some reason? Is it because we're hoping for punitive damages? Is it because we're wanting to go beyond the exact amount that can be calculated in some useful way? Are we hoping for punitive damages, as we've seen in some courts in jury trials in the United States, where hundreds of millions and billions of dollars are sometimes awarded against large corporations when the juries find it particularly offensive? Well, I didn't hear the Minister of Justice say that, and I didn't understand that punitive damages was exactly what this bill was about. I don't think it is. I think this bill is essentially about compensating the public purse for something which has been an enormous expense. So, if we're not looking for punitive damages, if we're not looking to try to persuade a jury somewhere that they ought to give some enormous sum well beyond the calculated amount, again, I ask, what's the point of a lawsuit? The issue should be, how much money are we out of pocket? Can we calculate it more or less precisely, at least so that we in this chamber, who ought to be the arbiters of this, are satisfied? And if that's the case, why don't we do that? So I don't understand why it is that there is a fashion spreading across the provinces in favor of lawsuits. Now, I suppose I should apologize to my colleagues in the legal profession for saying this, because I'm saying I don't see why it is that we either have to retain a private law firm or hire 6 extra lawyers in the Provincial Department of Justice to make this their life's work or their focus for the next 5 years. And who knows how many years on appeals after that. It might be interesting for them, they might enjoy it, they would certainly profit by it. But do we have to spend this money? Should we spend this money? Is this a useful thing to do? I don't believe it is. I think what we do is we say to the Honourable the Minister of Finance, please sit down with your officials, please sit down with the Honourable the Minister of Health and give us a number. How far back are we going to go? I don't know. I don't think we've heard from the government just how far back they're going to go. Since tobacco products were first sold by the manufacturers in Nova Scotia? Well, if that's it, that's fine. So be it. Let them say. But they should be able to give us a number. And if they can give us a number and demonstrate why they're at that number and explain how they get to those numbers, and if they seem satisfactory, we could be convinced. If we want to give the tobacco manufacturers an opportunity to dispute that number, let them come to law amendments. Let them talk to us in advance of the law amendments process. Let them come and say how much they think there has been injury in measurable dollars done to the public purse in Nova Scotia. Let them say their number. We can have our numbers. We can negotiate. We can see where we are. But why should we roll the dice and go for a lawsuit? This is beyond me. Now, I mentioned a minute ago the issue of time. Now, this worries me because think about it. Suppose this legislation goes ahead. This legislation is passed. We do research. A couple of years go by. We proclaim the legislation. We go to court. Two or three more years go by. There's a trial. And suppose we win. And then there's an appeal. And it goes to the Court of Appeal. And it goes maybe to the Supreme Court of Canada. A few more years go by. This is about a 7, maybe 8 or 10-year process. It's not inconceivable. And suppose we win. Suppose it goes all along the lines and we win. And we have a judgment. We have a judgment. There'll be a piece of paper in which the courts say the tobacco manufacturers now owe the government of Nova Scotia X numbers of millions of dollars. Let's hope they're in the hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe in the billions. What are we going to do with that piece of paper? 7 years from now, what are we going to do with that piece of paper? Maybe 10 years from now. How responsive to a judgment for hundreds of millions of dollars are the tobacco companies going to be 5 or 10 years from now? What are we going to execute upon? Are they just going to write us a check, do we think? Will they just cut us a check for our half a billion dollars, our $1 billion? What are we going to do? Are we going to execute? They don't have assets right here in the province. We're going to take it to somewhere, perhaps where? Virginia? Where are the manufacturing plants? Are we going to register that judgment in Virginia or some other state where they have manufacturing plants and then try to execute against those plants? Are we going to end up as the owners of a tobacco manufacturing plant in Virginia or some other state? Do we want that? Do we want to be the owners of a tobacco manufacturing plant somewhere in the United States or perhaps wherever they have them? Is this a good idea? Well, it's been suggested across the way that maybe there's a plant in Montreal. I know, indeed, I'm sure there are. But it doesn't matter if it's in Montreal and not in Virginia. What are we going to do with that plant? Indeed, 5 or 10 years from now, will those plants exist? This does not seem to me like a good idea. At the best, this lawsuit and its success is predicated upon the assumption that the tobacco companies will continue to be in business 10 years from now and doing healthy business. What kind of lawsuit is this? What kind of bill is this? Surely we can do better. And it's not clear to me that the tobacco companies that are the ones that we're dealing with here, the large ones that have traditionally marketed in Canada and the United States, are going to be able to continue to get revenues rolling in because of expanding markets in India and China. Let me tell you, in India and China, where there is very heavy smoking, they have their own indigenous tobacco companies that are making huge amounts of tobacco on their own, and there's no reason to think that there's going to be a huge amount of penetration of those markets by the Western manufacturing companies that are going to be the ones against whom we hope we have a judgment someday, maybe. What are we going to do with this piece of paper, the judgment that we finally get from the Supreme Court of Canada someday? Well, I'm sorry to be asking these questions if they're tough questions, but we have to think about this.
Sure do.
If there isn't a solid answer to these points, then we're engaging in something that looks like a charade. Now, I don't want it to be a charade. What I want is that indeed the tobacco manufacturers should be paying for the tobacco-related wrongs that they have undoubtedly engaged in. But I don't want this case to go before a jury. I don't want this case to go in front of a judge sitting without a jury. I don't want this case to go to court at all. I wonder if there is not some other way in which we can find the companies liable and simply say, here's how much you owe us, pay us. That seems to me not only a safer way, not only a less expensive way, but it seems to me a much more financially secure way of going about enriching the public purse in Nova Scotia and offsetting